Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria, please visit avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I am joined by Matthew Pinto, who is the founder and president emeritus of Ascension Press, the founder of the Theology of the Body Institute and the CatholicExchange.com, and currently working on a new Genesis group, a Catholic venture company.
Michael, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, so we're very happy to have you on the show today. You've written a lot of apologetic works, done a lot of apologetic writing and teaching, but also just founding so many different initiatives within the Catholic world that have been really just such a gift to so many. And even, right, your involvement with Ave Maria has been great because you've had a couple sons attend here.
I have 2 graduates and 1 presently, and then another son goes to another fine Catholic school in the Midwest. And then I have 2 other children who this is going to be on their short list.
Well, that's a great, and it's been fun. We've actually had, I think, about almost half a dozen guests on the show that are actually parents of Ave students, which has been just kind of fun now.
Great.
And, you know, what we wanted to talk about today is pilgrimage, right? Catholic pilgrimage, and specifically the pilgrimage of the Camino de Santiago, right? The way of St. James. The Camino is a lot more popular in recent years. I think many more people know about it, but it's still unknown to some. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I've heard, right, that you're going to be leading a pilgrimage of Ave Maria students this May.
I am. And this, Michael, will actually be the 5th time I've done the Camino. First time leading a group, I actually led some gentle pilgrims in the form of my 4 sons, my first 4 sons. We established a bit of a rite of passage that maybe we can talk about. But I've learned some things about how to do the Camino. I've learned some sublime things, some logistical things, and some sublime things. And so maybe we can talk about those today as well.
That's great. Yeah, it's one of the things we were talking a little bit about that right there. Just, you know, some of the gifts or blessings of a pilgrimage and of the Camino: solitude, fortitude, gratitude, fun, and communion with others, nature, and God. And so we're going to be turning to some of those. And also, you know, for those who aren't familiar with the Camino, you know, could you summarize what's the Camino in 90 seconds?
Yeah. Well, it's either the 3rd or 4th most visited Catholic location in the world, or religious spot for Christians in the world. You have the Holy Land, of course, Guadalupe in Mexico, and I think I understand Santiago, the cathedral in Santiago, to be number 3. But even if it's 4, 5, or 6, it's one of the biggest, and it's 1,000-year-old approximate, a 450-mile pilgrimage walk that has been trekked by kings and by saints, St. Francis of Assisi and others, as a pilgrimage. And I believe plenary indulgences have been tied to it. So people have done it for really ultimately faith reasons. Nowadays, and they have statistics on this, I think it's something like 25 to 30% are doing it for religious, spiritual reasons. Another 35% for cultural, and another 25 or so for just the physical experience of doing, a very long hike. But it's extraordinary, Michael, and you know this because you and your wife, and I'd like to hear about this as well, did it recently. Yeah. And so it's an amazing trek. It's arduous at times, and but really, really pretty rewarding.
Yeah, and there is that story that the apostle St. James, right, is buried there. That he had,
I missed the office.
He had preached around the Mediterranean. One of the things we know is that the apostles went around the Mediterranean preaching. We know Paul. We have Paul's itinerary, but we know that that's what the apostles did. And the way they would have gone around the Mediterranean was going around the seacoast and eventually you get up around Spain. So, right, this is somewhat reasonable, and right, I think it's in the 8th or the 9th. I think around like 814, somebody finds the bones of St. James, and they say that after he'd gone back to Jerusalem, he was beheaded in Jerusalem by Herod, and then his disciples took his body back to where he had preached in northwestern Spain in Galicia. And so there was pretty soon after, King Alfonso recognized it, built a chapel, and pilgrimages started. And it's really kind of amazing. And I think it was a couple different things. One is it's just fascinating. Like even I think St. Francis of Assisi made the Camino. St. Ignatius of Loyola. Right? Two of kind of the big one within the medieval, the Franciscans, and then the Jesuit order in the later early Renaissance period. That they made these things, and during a time also, one thing is to remember is from 711 basically to 1492, most of Spain was conquered. Was enemy occupied territory by the Muslims. Right. And so there was only a little bit of northern Spain that was still under kind of Catholic control, and that's where you could make the pilgrimage safely. In many ways, a lot of the other pilgrimages were not safe in those years. And so I think that's another fascinating aspect.
Fact, that is the obvious. In fact, you may have experienced this with your wife, but when you slow yourself down at the end of the pilgrimage, and first off, you're awestruck by this massive piazza and all these incredible buildings and architecture, and then this cathedral, which is really one of the grandest in Europe. After that initial half hour, and then you go in and you begin the tour and you see all the people and you're still kind of overwhelmed looking around. And then it dawns on you, oh, right, we need to get in line to go see the bones of the ossuary that holds the bones of St. James. And you're waiting in line. And if you slow your mind down enough, as I was able to do, I think, in all 4 instances, or at least 3 of them, and you're within 20 yards of the ossuary, and you begin to realize, wow, the bones of one of the 12 apostles is right here. And then with a grateful heart, with a pleading heart, asking for the intercession of St. James, it really was one of the best moments of the pilgrimage after walking many, many, many miles and being able to enter into that spiritual aspect. So in your opening question of describing it, I missed the obvious. Yes, of course, the bones of St. James is really why we're all doing this ultimately.
And when the bones of St. James, in a way, everywhere the apostles went kind of becomes the Holy Land. Right? Yeah. They bring Christ, the message of Christ, that Christ, whom was killed, is risen from the dead, has ascended into heaven, sits at the right hand of the Father in glory, and he sent his Holy Spirit, right, so that we may have forgiveness of sins and eternal life. And so, right, when we are walking where the apostles walked, we're walking where Jesus walked with the apostles, through the apostles. And I just was overwhelmed by that aspect that we're walking where the apostles walked, which is in a certain sense walking in the footsteps of Christ, who promised, right, that he would not leave his apostles orphans, right, but that he would send his Spirit so that, right, we remain then connected to the footsteps of Christ through the footsteps of the apostles.
I love that turn of phrase. And in fact, I'm definitely going to start using that with my kids and maybe during the pilgrimage, that where the apostles are is a form of Holy Land. And I guess we could extrapolate even further, correct me here if I'm wrong, but even where the Eucharist is, there is a miniature Holy Land. But I love that image of, no, there was something, of course, particularly unique about the original 12 and the 11 and then Matthias, who replaced Judas. There is a special uniqueness, at least in my mind, but I imagine all of our minds. Ergo, to be able to trace one of the treks of one of the apostles. And I love the fact that he was there. They call it the Iberian Peninsula, I believe is what and then they brought his bones back. I mean, that It's powerful, and it hit me. My middle name is James. I have a son, James, and I have another son whose middle name is James. So we have an extra connection there. But I would encourage anyone, after you do the big pilgrimage, and it's awesome on 5 levels, to really though have the crescendo of your Camino de Santiago trip be the focal point, the point of the arrow of that private room, the 20 yards away from the ossuary where the bones of St. James are, and radically ask his intercession, for the rest of your life.
That's really beautiful and powerful. And that connection, we're one holy Catholic and apostolic church. We remain apostolic. We celebrate the feasts of the apostles. And I think sometimes even people don't know this about Rome, right? Rome is where the Pope is, but that's not why we go to Rome. Right? I mean, it's great. Don't get me wrong. But the reason why Rome is because Peter and Paul were killed in Rome. And what the Christians did is they went to the bones of Peter, right? Which is why under St. Peter's is actually Peter. Peter's remains, Peter's physical remains. The bones of Peter are under St. Peter's. And so again, it's that sense of visiting, and then there's St. Paul outside the walls, but these are the actual churches that are, and I don't know how to put it, if they're not exactly where the bones of the apostles were, they're darn near where the bones of the apostles were, and the bones of the apostles are somewhere. And so this certain sense that we have this historical connectedness to our faith. And, therefore we, develop these, shrines. And, one thing I wanted to also just add is there's another kind of Ave Maria link between the Camino, and it's that, so there was a student here, let me make sure I get his name right, is now Father, Jordan Berghaus. He's, an Ave grad, I think from maybe 2012 or so, and he's now a priest in, Wisconsin. And his bishop, Donald Hying, Bishop of Madison, Wisconsin, made the pilgrimage and narrated a documentary on it, which Father Jordan's mother, Erin Berghaus, who's an award-winning producer and composer, developed as part of Ahava Productions, and it's called Santiago: The Camino Within. It's a beautiful retelling, or very just beautiful cinematography and musical composition to kind of draw you into the Camino. And the bishop and Father Jordan Berghaus came to Ave Maria last fall. So I think this was fall of 22. And they basically showed the Camino Within, Santiago, the Camino Within, and then they talked about it. And 2 things. One is my wife and I were there, and it kind of inspired us to think maybe we could do this. But the other thing that was a huge breakthrough, which was a little secret of the Camino that I never understood before, was I always thought you had to do all 34 days and the whole long pilgrimage from the Pyrenees, what's now I understand is the Camino Frances, the French way. But he unveiled this little secret, which is all you have to do is 100 kilometers. And as long as
60 miles.
Yeah, as long as you do 100 kilometers, you actually can get the Compostela. Yeah. And you can get the certificate.
To clarify a little bit, it's the final 100 kilometers. Yes. And of course, any company who's connected with the Camino knows exactly to show you how to do it. In fact, the Ave trip, we're going to adjust that a little, but we're going to do the final 60, but we can come back to that. But yes, you do the final 100 kilometers or 60 miles and finish, you were saying.
And so then that was what allowed, my wife and I were just not in a position where we felt like we could take a month off. Yeah. But we knew we could there's no situation in which we can't take a week off. Yeah. So we took 9 days off for our 29th anniversary.
That's great.
And it was really just an amazing spiritual, marital renewal, walking the way of St. James. But it was but that was what did it. I always thought when people were only doing the last 100 kilometers, or they were doing 100 kilometers, it was just some odd thing. But I realized, no, it's actually built into the system. And obviously the longer one's beautiful too. I'm not denigrating the full experience, but that was what allowed us to kind of dive in and make it possible.
And for those who are listening, who may know this but probably don't, you sort of need to prove that you've done the 60 miles or 100 kilometers through the pass book that you get where you stop in stores and different places and you get your stamp. So I presume you have your book and your stamps as your evidence that you show to the people at the end who give you the Compostela, I think is what it is. So
let's just step back for a minute, and this maybe could be something for, again, people who may or may never go on the Camino. But let's just talk a little bit about pilgrimage. What's the nature of pilgrimage? Maybe even on a natural level and on a Christian level. Why is it part of the Catholic kind of heritage that we should try to recover?
Yeah, and I would rely on you for a good bit of maybe filling in some of the biblical and theological connections. We know that in the book of Psalms, Psalm 84, we hear the Lord speak to us about being sent out on pilgrimage, and it's physical, but it's ultimately a spiritual trek that we're called to. Pilgrimage really has a way of ripping you from your everyday grind. You and I have the best of intentions at times. We have intentions of getting to Mass and intentions of doing our rosary, but life sets in. Pilgrimage has this ability of really just removing you from your everyday life and setting the conditions wherein you can begin to enter in. And so one of the things that happened to me, and I'm sure it happened to you and your wife, is that you're taken away. You don't really have a connection to the phone. And in fact, even just listening to music, I kind of tried to limit and encourage my sons to limit. So the first thing it does is it just breaks you away from the day-to-day grind. And what happens, Michael, and you probably know this just from your experience, you just begin to think more. And when you start to think more, you begin to assess priorities. And if you're a person who's serious, especially serious about faith, you begin to make adjustments. And so it puts you in a completely new setting, and you really, I would venture to say that it has to be 90+% of all people come back differently in some way. Because, one of perhaps the greatest nemesis of the human spirit and the human aspiration of growing in faith is the distraction, is the obligation, is the daily grind. And so if you can set up things to pull you away from that, it's highly likely, unless you're traveling with a bunch of clowns and you really have very little depth and you're not even remotely interested in pursuing depth, short of that, you're going to make progress in life. One final point. Good friend of mine, Greg Popchak, a good Catholic psychologist, pointed out that no real growth happens outside of the arena of reflection. And the Camino, if it does one thing for you, sure, you're walking with your wife and your children and your friends, but eventually you start walking separately for little treks here and there. And you're living in your own mind, and reflection happens and growth happens. Was that your experience?
Absolutely. I've gone on many annual retreats, and in all retreats, I always find that sense of stepping aside from the world. Jesus went alone on the mountains to pray. He took retreats. But one of the things he also did was frequently took pilgrimages to Jerusalem, right? Which might have been, like a 5-6 day walk at different points from, northern Galilee and things. And we know, of course, famously when he was young, he went with his parents and he got lost. Like he stayed in the temple, they left, and it took them, they had to walk a day, wait a day, or come back, and all this different elements. So we know that Jesus not only went on retreats, but he also went on pilgrimages to Jerusalem. Now, in many ways, right, we have the Jerusalem, but we also have new Jerusalems where Jesus and his apostles went. Rome, Santiago de Compostela, where his mother went, Our Lady Guadalupe, these sorts of different things where we can go as places of pilgrimages. And every little shrine, God is everywhere, but we're not with God everywhere. So we have to somehow withdraw from everything and everywhere in order to go somewhere to find someone. And it reminds me that in 1929, Pius XI issued an encyclical called Mens Nostra. So it's basically in our mind, as the papal mind, is that all religious and priests should go on an annual retreat and follow something like the spiritual exercises. Laity are also encouraged to do this. But in 1929, so 100 years ago, he says this. He says that our age is filled with a grave disease of seeking novelties, of distractions, of what's another of I think he shows it kind of like
amusements.
It's like a worthless levity where we're just seeking distractions, and even then when we try to do something, we are confined to the material, and so we just try to find material solutions, right? And this is 100 years ago. He sees the modern world has already fallen into
I'm glad we've gotten out of that. I'm glad we were able to move past those modern banality, distraction, amusements, triflings.
Exactly. So just with the rise of cities and radio, he saw that.
Wow.
And he saw it as that if the priests and religious were going to be able to have a fruitful apostolate, really help to convert souls. And really, I would say not like to be a light, to be that light and salt in the midst of a world that's deeply confused and deeply distracted.
Yeah.
We need to foster that. And how do we do it? He says we have a grave disease that's going on. Well, if it was going on in the 1920s, it's certainly going on in the 2020s.
Yes.
So that, and I think that sense of like retreats and pilgrimages have been a normal part of Catholic life. Certainly for the last 1,000 years and in different ways before when they would go on pilgrimages to the desert or to monasteries or to different places. So I love that idea. And I know for me, I really do feel like it was, I was very nervous until I went. I was very nervous that I would be in another, we'd be in another continent if there was a problem, if, we're not visiting grandchildren, we're not visiting children. What about work? And it's so funny. It's like as soon as you land and you put your feet on the ground, you're like, what was I like? Who did I think I was? Like, did I actually think I was God?
Yeah. Wow.
Do you know what I mean? Like, why do I actually have this illusion that somehow I can save the world or I can, and you just realize, wait a second, Lord, this is a time for me to surrender totally to you, to let God be God and let me be a gentle, faithful, often clueless, prideful disciple.
Were you talking to my wife with that rattling off of those clueless? Fully agree on every point. Two connectors came, a little bit random, but they still kind of lead to the same jewel of the benefits of pilgrimage and breaking away. One, the Amish. We live near the Amish in suburban Philadelphia. And, they use actual vehicles that you and I would use occasionally, but they use the buggies and they use, the foot scooters, and they really detach much of things that would speed up life. And, I think a certain balance is off there, but needed there. And I'm sure the net effect over that community is kind of like a healthy fog that facilitates certain good things. Secondly, another random thought, but only because it's a little bit relevant to my life, is seminaries being set apart. So the men really can, for a period of time, be without distraction. I have a son who's he's in his third year at seminary. He's an Ave grad. And he said to me in his second year, the first year was a spiritual year. He then was having his first year on St. Charles campus in Philadelphia. And he said as he pulled in for his second year, but really his first year of on the seminary campus, he said, it was fabulous. He said, I had no distractions of sports, of which he was a competitive sportsman, including here at Ave. Girls, or no distraction. He said, I really just had spiritual and intellectual formation. And he was looking at it with such great hope and joy and eagerness. And so I think all of these things are connected. I'm sure it was the case with you and your wife. It was the case with me and my sons that you talk a whole lot on like the first day. and then a little bit less on the second day. And then even in times you break 25 yards ahead, 25 yards back, you walk with someone else for a few minutes that you meet. But really you do start to get time to yourself, maybe about a third of the way through, and just as fabulous.
Very well. Matthew, thank you so much for diving into this with me. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit maybe about how you developed this or fell into this, right, with your sons, and then a little bit of these 5 blessings or gifts that you've suggested or outlined, and kind of go through them at least a little. We won't be able to dive into all of them, but at least a little bit. After the break, we'll return to them.
Very good.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
So today we've been talking about your experience with the Camino de Santiago, the journey to the bones of St. James in the Santiago de Compostela Cathedral that has been has been calling Catholics since the 9th century. It was estimated that in the 12th century, I think there were over 250,000 pilgrims a year. In some ways, in the 1300s, there were massive famines and then massive plagues, the Black Plague, Black Death, and these sorts of things. And so everything kind of shut down a bit. But that really, so it's kind of amazing to kind of enter into it. And I've also learned that it was actually in the 1980s that a priest from Lugo, a Spanish priest, basically went back and took a can of yellow paint and started putting the yellow arrows on it. And so it's really been the last 40 years that we've had a kind of a renaissance of the Camino.
And I think the numbers are now into the 300 plus thousands. Yes. Also, lest we forget, it just jumped into my head, and you triggered it with the priest from Lugo. I thought you were going to touch on the Eucharistic miracle, but there is a Eucharistic miracle on the Camino. It's at about the 100-mile mark, so 160-kilometer mark. It's one of approximately just 50 in the world. And you know how I spoke to you about this the bones of St. James being that focal point in that particular. Well, similarly, you can slow yourself down and enter into the fact that within 25 feet of me here is another ossuary with the Eucharistic Lord that turned to flesh.
Yeah. So tell us just a little bit. Obviously, we can't go through all of it, but you developed this kind of as a rite of passage with your son. So this came from your own life as a father.
Yeah. Like many, I take the fatherhood question real seriously. I read many good Steve Wood resources about 25 to 30 years ago. He is a convert to Catholicism, and much of his ministry was about fatherhood. So even before marriage, I had read a lot about fatherhood, and that really shaped what eventually would be. And so, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, I read a Protestant book called Raising a Modern Day Knight, because we have 6 children. The first 5 were boys. And so I knew that I had to be present in their life. And so I read about this book, Raising a Modern Day Knight, and within it, it spoke about rites of passage. And it also made the point that when you look back at your elementary school experience, some of the best memories are when you did trips. You went to the zoo or you did something. They stand out in your mind as a young person. There's something about, and I think it's probably connected to our, body-spirit composite and, the gift that the world is. So, to make a long story short, I initiated 2 rites of passage. I had an 8th grade rite of passage dinner, but then prior to going into college, I really wanted to do something bigger. And so I thought of this idea of doing the Camino Walk with my sons, and I've done it with 4 of my sons. I've done the dinner with 5. because I had 5 8th grade graduates, and I've done the Camino Walk with 4, and this upcoming summer or next, I'll do it with my 5th son. And we go, Michael, we go with an intentionality as well, a prayer intention, and where for 9 days we pray for a particular intention. You can keep it to yourself or share it with each other. And so the long and short, connected to a rite of passage, the idea of breaking your son or your daughter, in the case of my daughter a few years from now, away to have that private time, not only with them, but ultimately private time with themselves and private time with the Lord.
It's really inspiring, and I think it's a great invitation for, in many different ways, maybe it could be imitated, but also adjusted to wherever people are. And for those who have young children, maybe something to look up to or again, adjust for your own circumstances. Or, if you have older children, maybe still kind of thinking of something of these ways of creating little, maybe, moments of memorable moments in a way, and where we can try to help one another on the journey. That's one of the big things I found from the Camino, is that when you're on the Camino and you're walking maybe, 10, 15 more miles a day, and, you're tired at different points, you're walking, you're getting up, you're walking, you're then breaking for lunch, and then you're sitting down, your legs might stiffen up a little bit, you're eating, you get a little cafe, cafe the espresso that I enjoy so much. And then you got to walk again. And then when you're done, it gives you a kind of purpose. Mm-hmm. One of the things I really felt was a strong, keen sense of, I knew what my big goal was, and I knew what my short goal was. My big goal was to get to Santiago. My short goal was to get to the next village. Mm-hmm. And that's what it was. Mm-hmm. And to do so, right, remaining cheerful, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. It's like on the Camino, which is a spiritual pilgrimage, it just seems silly for me to get irritable with my wife. Like, I kind of okay, I can't give in to irritation with either other pilgrims or other things. I have to, it's like you have this strength. I have to grow in purpose. I have to become more purposeful, but also more patient and more peaceful. Yeah. And then you just realize that that's all my life is. Mm. All my life is a journey to God, in which I need to just recognize I have to do this today. This is my work. This is my purposefulness. Mm-hmm. And I need to be peaceful. And when I have that, it's, I remember a lot of Catherine of Siena, who says, all the way to heaven is heaven, for Jesus says, I am the way. Right. Yeah, that's beautiful. And in Spanish, that's, I am the Camino.
Yeah. That's great. All good reflections. In fact, I think there were times when what you described, your attempt to keep yourself in joy, irritation. I think I did it most of the time, but even just hearing the obvious right now is good. And I'm probably going to carry that into the next 2 that I do. You triggered a couple thoughts. I thought when you're walking with your wife in your instance, or one of my children in my instance, and you're suffering, because there's an element. I mean, we did some big days. We did a couple days that were 25, which you learn from your mistakes, and I did in my later Caminos with my later children. But even the 10s or 15s, you start to get tired. And here's the point. It made me think of the whole band of brothers in war thing. My sons and I had communion with each other at the end of the day. In fact, if I were to get on the phone right now and put one of my sons on speakerphone without him knowing that he's getting interviewed, and say to him, James, remember we went on the Camino and we would stop at those cafes that you mentioned? What did we get to drink? And he said, those Cokes were the best. So in other words, one of the points I'll share in these 5 points is the gratitude. But this band of brothers, or in the case of your spouse, when you're suffering with someone, it forms a communion. And we had great communion even without talking at times, because we were on a common mission. We were a miniature band of brothers in war, in miniature, because we had no choice. We had to get to our certain destination because we had preset destinations. We had to get to our destination that day. And if you're tired, I'm sorry, we got to get to that destination. So it really formed bonds. And then the second point is, it's one of the 5 points that I bring up, 5 gifts, is it really helps you celebrate gratitude and the little things of life, which became huge. I mean, that Coca-Cola after trekking for 4 miles was like the greatest thing I've ever had, so.
It is delightful and helps us to reawaken, I think, a sense of wonder and gratitude. You mentioned 5 of these blessings or gifts, and I know you spoke about these when you met with some of Ave's students to talk about the trip. The first 3, they're easy to remember because they all rhyme in different ways, right? Solitude, fortitude, gratitude. Before we say more about them, I did want to mention one thing that, of all things, there was a basketball player named Dwayne Wade who played for the Miami Heat. And it was kind of a well-known player a decade or so ago. He graduated from Marquette University, went back and did Marquette's graduation address. I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago. In that address, he talks about solitude. And he says that our world needs solitude. He said people become isolated because they can't be alone with themselves, so they distract themselves with other people or other things. But what they need to learn is solitude.
Nice.
Now, Dwayne Wade is not, I'm not in any, not suggesting him as kind of an oracle of Catholic wisdom at all. But it's like, I felt like, wow, somebody who's kind of like in the midst of everything, who has all this stuff, realized that he, after the NBA, had to learn how to live. And what was key to that was recovering solitude. And that really kind of always, I love seeing in a way when people sometimes who are maybe not seeing like necessarily from within the faith, but they discover things that you're like, oh, wait a second. Because remember, the faith, the God of our faith is also the God of creation. And so he's inscribed all the principles of faith are kind of inscribed into the very bones of creation. So people will discover them. And it just really reminded me of like, wow, solitude.
Just like you and I were talking a little bit before the show that even if people go for certain reasons that are cultural or whatever, I'll take that because what happens in the process is beautiful. Similarly, I'll take Dwayne Wade's latching onto the truth of solitude. And I would go a step further by saying, if the world, there's no one single bullet as a strategy. We know the Lord, of course, is, sufficient in himself, but as a strategy to lead people to the Lord, there is no one strategy. But I would put solitude in maybe a top 5 or top 10, because if people are living in the realm of solitude without frivolous distraction, you can't help but start to look inside. And then at a certain point of looking inside, you realize that's not enough, which hopefully, God willing, then leads you to look beyond. So solitude is golden. I have a quote here from the book of Psalms, "My soul rests in God alone." Just the idea of slowing down and resting. God is really the only basket that can sufficiently carry you or hold you. You can rest, by watching Netflix to a certain extent. It might also disturb your spirit by leisurely recreation, but there's a whole nother level of rest. And the Camino does that, even though you're working, because there's a dual track going on in your head when you're walking the Camino. It's rigorous, but the rigor sort of obliterates a lot of the frivolities of life and distractions. And then it kind of forces you down a pathway of self-introspection and other external, because it obliterates things. So also there's a great quote by Mother Teresa, "God speaks to us in the silence of our heart." So this gift, Michael, of solitude is absolutely one for all except fools, and the totally frivolous for the whole 100 or 400 miles. You will receive gifts if you can enter into solitude.
Yeah, you've spoken a little bit about fortitude, just the strength that can be required to finish the day, the sense of accomplishment when one does. Which is, and I think it's also like welcoming all the things happen. One day it rains, your rain gear works, but you're surprised that you're still soaked afterwards. Or my wife kind of developed a slight sprain, during the time. And so we had to adjust. We couldn't walk quite as far. We had to take we slowed down. We realized like our secret weapon was walking slowly.
Yeah.
That if we slowed down, we could walk farther.
Yeah.
Kind of like, whoa, that's a little, just these different things.
And more rest stops, literally just sitting down. I would say to my boys, go ahead. I'll catch up to you in a little bit. Let me touch on fortitude, though.
Sure.
I have an interesting anecdote. So son number 3, we did it in the summer, as we did with all of them. And then he had football practice that started on August 15th, as it does for schools all around the country, that middle of August. And he had 2-a-days in football. And he after doing the Camino, where we were walking for 10 or 12 or maybe more hours, he said to me, he said, Dad, doing the 2-a-day football practices was nothing. He said, but outside of doing the Camino, I would have been so close to those 2-a-days that they would have been brutal. But with the comparative of walking 10, 11, 12 hours a day on the Camino, his 2-a-days were chip shots. So
that's great. And gratitude's such an amazing, really, attitude, right? It's sometimes, I think all the Psalms are really Psalms of thanksgiving at their ultimate core. If the Psalms of distress are always Psalms of distress, asking God to deliver us and then eventually thanking us for delivering him. And right, the very Eucharist the word Eucharist means gratitude. And I appreciate your showing how we can even become just grateful for the little things and grateful for and then the funny thing is you do realize the little things aren't little. Because I become grateful for the fact that I'm alive, for the fact that I have legs, for the fact that I can breathe.
Seriously.
Yeah, and I realize my body is a gift.
Yeah.
And it's exactly as it is. Not because it not like this kind of empirical standards by which we measure it, but just because it is. And I walk exactly as far as I walk. Each of us may walk different paces. It doesn't matter. It's you can begin to become grateful for reality.
Yeah. And I use that word. It's a bit strong, obliterate, but the sheer length of the Camino, the sheer grind. It's not like climbing Mount Everest, which is a whole nother level of fitness required. It's slow, it's sublime, and it's consistent. The sheer magnitude of it does kind of obliterate a lot of the smaller things in life, and I think it brings about a lot of gratitude. We had a lot of gratitude at the end of the day, sitting down in the town square at nighttime when you're tired and having a pizza brought to you, or being able to take these incredible showers that were no different than the showers we take every day, but they were just whole other level of better. So I think there's something there, but by removing ourselves from the creature comforts of every day in an elongated manner, really does singe, at least in my mind, but I think in all minds, the gratitude of so many little things in life.
We are starting to come towards the end of our, episode today. But could you say a word about fun and communion?
Yeah.
Right, the last two.
Yeah. So I originally put this together for college students, and college students are still in that newness of life phase where it's just. They need fun, and the Camino is fun. I mean, culturally, you've experienced this. You're walking through villages that now have 20 people there that used to have 200, but you're amazed at the cultural visuals that you're seeing. And then those little villages are juxtaposed against these mind-blowing cathedrals that it took them 50 years or so to build, and you're thinking, how did they do that? And then you're experiencing other cultures and other foods and just kind of real eye-opening things. So on a purely natural level, it's just a fun trip. And I also think those of us who are older and doing the grind, of our obligations, it's a great breakaway for us, just on a natural fun level. And then the last one you spoke about is communion, and I divided this communion, Michael, into 3 categories: communion with others. We were made to be gifts of self and to receive others as gifts. Communion with nature. Now that may sound new agey for others, but no. For those who have eyes to see, there's a great quote. William Shakespeare says, "The earth has music for all who will listen." There's music and evidences of God's creation all around you. It's some beautiful scenery, mountains, and you go from walking through a mile of being under trees in the wood, and then on the other end of it is a mountain vista. So it just taught me about the sublime beauty of God and all the little ways he's entering into our world. And then the last communion, again, communion with others, communion with nature, communion with God himself, which of course is the ultimate call of all of our earthly treks.
We were talking as well during the break that I think both of us enjoyed a movie from 2010 by Martin Sheen. Well, Martin Sheen was in it. I think Emilio Estevez directed it, which was called The Way. And some people might find that a fun movie to watch, kind of a father who loses a son. His son actually dies on the Camino, and then the father makes the journey and somehow finds a sense of peace. And I do find that element. There is something in our tradition that loves Jesus. Jesus is the center of our faith, without a doubt, right? Mm-hmm. Jesus is the center of the Camino, right? Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And yet it's also the case that we also love nature, right? Mm-hmm. Grace doesn't destroy, it perfects nature, right? Mm-hmm. Faith does not destroy, but perfects reason. Mm-hmm. So we also love reason, nature, creation, and I found this way of seeing, even like Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. He knew the consolation of Christ, but he writes about the consolation of philosophy. So I felt that there was something about the Camino that does draw in people at this kind of almost natural, mystical level of looking for something more. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, that more is a person, who is the person of Jesus Christ. But the fact that it takes all of this up so that I'm not only having a spiritual retreat, I'm having an emotional retreat, I'm having a physical retreat, and I felt like that's just such a gift. And to kind of see, one, that I need to have a retreat on all those levels. And then secondly, I can meet people where they are in kind of accompanying them on their journeys.
Yeah. I think you would agree with this. The Camino is a very human experience. You rattled off three, just in the flesh. It's a very human experience. And I think akin to how those who worked with the earth for the past 6,000 or 6 million years, there seems to be a catechesis of human living that happens when you're that low, to the earth, literally and in a kind of communion sense. And the Camino is not Disneyland. It's radically different than going to Disneyland for a week, because it's so earthy, and it's the word. If I only had one word, and I've said this to people for 10 years now, one word. If I only had one word to describe the Camino, it's sublime in how it works on you at a physical, psychological, emotional, relational level. You don't know it's happening to you, but it is absolutely happening to you because of the sheer number of miles you're walking that day. So,
well, again, thank you so much, Matt, for being on the show. I have 3 questions I'd like to ask our guests. So what's a book you're reading?
Yeah, so I just started reading Strong Fathers, Strong Daughters by Meg Meeker. I'm reading multiple books, as we all do at the same time. I got some business books going. I'm reading a book called Who, Not How in Business, that we often try and figure out the solution, but it often is a who instead of a how we'll do it. But I'm really looking forward to the Meg Meeker book. I'm maybe 20% into it right now. So.
What's a practice you do on a daily or regular basis to help you draw closer to God and find meaning and purpose in your life?
Yeah, I have a rhythm that I maybe hit with 80%, clipping. It's maybe not as much daily, but during the week I try and do Monday, Wednesday, Friday Mass, and then I try and get adoration in between then, and I try and do the Rosary each day. I try and make it with whatever family members are there. Our family members a lot of them are gone now. So I try and do those. And for Lent, I'm going to do something that my oldest son just finished with his wife, a St. Gertrude novena, which it's a full year, and it's not for the faint of heart. It's like 25 minutes connected with purgatory. And so I'll be starting that for Lent, and a little intimidated because it's a longish reading each day. So.
And what's a belief you held about God that you later discovered was false? Yeah,
I mean, I think a little bit maybe of the zapping God has over the past 30 years has been gone. Although simultaneously, while I may have had a little bit of that, I always felt that there was a benevolence that dominated it. But let me just think about this: a belief about God. Well, one truth of the faith that I'm enamored with, and ultimately it's connect with God, is I've come to love, Michael, in the past, 5 to 8 years, Catholicism's comfort with the world. We understand and then we extrapolate the incarnation seriously. We understand it, that God became man, therefore it's an affirmation of the created world. And if God is affirming the created world, albeit fallen and marred, that the world is good and the things of the world are good, and that a fully Catholic life involves dancing appropriately with the things of the world. So maybe the discovery was a default to joy and being awed by creation, and being given permission to really participate in it and squeeze properly from it all that is good.
Well, that is beautiful, and that's a great image. And that's kind of, I think, both probably that vision helped you to go on the Camino and take advantage of it. And it's also a great way of bringing the Camino back, right? Bringing the Camino back to our lives. And I did, just for people who are interested, the show that was the documentary that was put on by an Ave parent, by Hava Productions. I think it was Erin Berghaus and her son, Father Jordan Berghaus. The show was called Santiago, the Camino Within. And it was also Bishop Donald Hying who was helped participate in that and lead it and also narrate it. And again, today our guest has been Matthew Pinto, founder and president emeritus of Ascension Press, co-founder of the Theology of the Body Institute, CatholicExchange.com, and now working on a new project, the Genesis Group, a Catholic venture capital company. So thank you so much for your service to really a renewal of the church, renewal of Catholic theology, apologetics, evangelization, and also for being an Ave parent and sending. I've had some of your sons in my classes, and I think a daughter-in-law perhaps. So I'm very grateful.
And my youngest son, on his own, started listening to your podcast, brought it to our attention. Hey, look what I'm listening to. And about a week or two ago, walked in with your book. And so all on his own, he discovered you over the airwaves and is enjoying your work. If you don't mind, Michael, for those interested in the Camino at Ave or elsewhere, you can go to collegecamino.com and find out all about what we're doing. collegecamino.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Matthew. And thanks for listening to our show today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.